probably tell from that I've got ADD. I think I had attention deficit disorder ever since I was a kid, but it wasn't known as a condition then. And I just thought I was had ants in my pants. But I had taken the scenic route through life and done some interesting things on the way through. And now with RMNZ Group, we focus on how to surround audiences, how to nail down. And all my life, in fact, I spent my life trying to figure out what makes people tick and how to sell stuff to them. You know, how do we actually engage with them? And through the magazines and the websites and the stuff that we develop, we do that pretty much all the time. So I've entitled my presentation and using technology the best way I know how. I'll try and keep my presentation to the allotted time. But technology isn't always like me, and I'll explain more of that tomorrow when I talk to you. One of the things that we did, and when we started advertising, I started advertising in the early 70s, and it was really easy then. We had 5 tools. You had television, you had radio, print, magazines, and press, outdoor, billboards, etc., and direct marketing. And if you took an ad in the Listener and an ad on TV1, you reached pretty much anyone in the country that wasn't in a coma. Like it wasn't hard. And we did some really interesting things in that time. But now, of course, it's much more complicated. And we've not just got those basic 5 tools. There's another 50-odd tools that we've got to use in order to reach people. So, and it's almost overwhelming. And we kind of wonder and worry about how we're actually going to make our businesses hum with all these different fragmentation, or the fragmentation of audience, and the fragmented way in which you've actually got to reach people. But I argue that it's actually no different to what it always was. It's just a bit more painstaking. Because as David mentioned, that my approach is the storytelling approach rather than the geek approach. I'm not a geek at all. And in fact, my head gets full of static when people start telling me how many amps and gigs and megabytes and stuff goes on the computer. And to me, it's not important. To me, the computer, or the way in which we reach people, is just the plumbing. I want to focus on what goes down the pipes. And I think that if over the next 45 minutes, I can sort of tell you the war stories, effectively, of what we've done to actually make that work. And the interesting thing, too, with social networks is that it's not just the kids. I mean, the kids, obviously, at this end of the spectrum, use it a lot. And they get home from school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and use up all your bandwidth from telecom, downloading stuff on Facebook or watching dodgy stuff that they've found somewhere online. But it's actually the 35-plus age group who are the biggest users of social media. They don't use it as often, they don't use it as frequently, but in fact we're all connected in some way. So it's actually an older profile than you would normally think. It's interesting though, what goes on. A lot of it's bullshit, particularly on Twitter. As you can see from the blue and the red sections, that's basically conversational stuff. How you got up in the morning, farted twice and had breakfast, and this is just mindless babble. There's a little bit that's interesting up here, a bit of news and a lot of spam and some self-promotion, but some of that's sort of pass along value. About 8% of what goes on Twitter does have some pass along value, but that's not to dismiss it, because all that stuff starts by people having fun, and they get it into their lives and they start using it, and eventually it will become, and you see it now. You've been watching CNN in the last couple of days with the Boston Marathon bombings, and they're tracking the things that are happening to those 2 brothers by people sort of tweeting constantly about where they're going. So everyone's in touch all the time, and everyone's in touch all the time around the world. Because of these kind of tools. So we need to understand how to use them and how to actually take advantage of them. Of course, everyone's blogging, and they say that there's I love this cartoon. Yes, we could read your blog, but tell us about your school day. I mean, even the kids are doing it, of course. And a lot of them use it as a substitute for actually talking. And the sad thing is we've got a whole generation of kids who are more adept with their thumbs than their tongues. And I think that it's an interesting trend. And I was interested to hear the comment from the competence guy that a lot of the training now is actually done either on on video or kinesthetically rather than reading. Because I personally think, and we've got 8 magazines that we own in our company, Dish, Rugby World, Fishing World, but Rugby World is the magazine that's struggling, because rugby fans by and large can get all they want about rugby either from television or daily newspapers and radio. They're bombarded with stuff, and I don't think they're big readers of in depth about what's happening. Funnily enough, our biggest single sales outlet for Rugby World magazine is the shop opposite Carter Farms Park. The problem there is, of course, we've got to ship it over there, take a couple of months, then you've got to get it paid from a distributor, and it's all too hard. But now with an online version, we can sort of reach them instantaneously. But you see, a lot of the stuff that people are actually following is video content rather than written content. And I think that we're actually moving away from a written tradition. Our kids, or my grandkids, I think they learn by watching and listening rather than by reading. And that was the way of the world up until 500 years ago when Gutenberg invented the printing press. Everything was an oral tradition. And now I think we're lucky we've got video as well. In fact, a mate of mine is a doctor in Takapuna, a GP. And he got sick of dealing with, I know he's from the North Shore here, he got sick of dealing with the worried world from Takapuna. People who've got a bit of navel lint and wonder if they're going to die because of it. And he thinks he'll go and treat some really sick people in the outback of Australia. And he spends, at the moment, a week a month. He makes more money in his week a month from the outback of Australia. But he got really worried because being a GP, he hasn't done any surgery. So he thought, so what happens if someone has appendicitis and had to do an op and the flying doctor 6 hours away? He went on YouTube. So, God, I don't want to go to the red heart of Australia when he's around. But that's the way. That's what. The other day we were going to a black tie thing. I'd forgotten how to. And my wife won't let me one of those clip-on bow ties. I had to tie it, and I'd forgotten how to tie a bow tie. Went on YouTube. There it was. And we'll learn by watching and listening. But the interesting thing is, how do you actually make sense of all this, and how do you know which of the social networks or social media you should be using? How do you choose? And we were actually in Queenstown a couple of years ago. We were driving through the Quarra Gorge and saw those little awful stone huts that the miners lived in. And Michelle said, God, it must be awful how cold it was. Did they ever make any money? Was it worth it? And it occurred to me then, of course, the guy who made most of the money out of the gold rushes weren't any of the gold miners, it was the guy who sold the shovels to the miners. Now, that's an insight that we can actually use to figure out how to make sense of social networks, because there are so many of them. Where should you go? And you've got to pick where your audience is. There's no point in putting your bait off the side of your boat and the fish aren't there. So you've got to figure out where those fish are. And we thought one of the ways we could do it would be to aggregate all the information, the chatter that's going on online, find out what the important conversations are, drill down, find out who's talking to who the most influential people on those networks are. So we built a software package called Chatterbox. We've got a whole lot of geeks who know a lot more about these things than I do. And so that you figure out, well, what do you want to know? What are the variables that oops, sorry, go back. What are the variables that you want to know? In other words, what information do you want? Which sites of those social networks do you want to actually monitor? What data do you want from them? And there's a program called latent semantic indexing. You can actually teach a computer to understand whether the conversation is positive or negative. And so that over time, one of the problems, of course, is that the computer doesn't recognise some words. If you say, look, that's really good shit, it's actually a positive comment, but the computer will think that it's bad. Or if you're talking about a dog, are you talking about Pluto, or are you talking about Christina Aguilera, or whatever it is, or Kim Kardashian. So you don't. So you actually have to train the computer as to what the value of those words are. But then you can give that a rating. So you can just how important are the people in those conversations? Are they? I mean, if I put it on my blog, it wouldn't matter at all. But if the New Zealand Herald put it on their blog, there'd be hundreds of people, so it'd be a lot more influential than anything I had to say. And then in the end, show it in a way that is visually relevant. For example, for those of you who are from Auckland, and don't hate me, we did Lynn Brown's mayoral campaign, and every month we monitor all the chatter that's going on online and give it to them in a dashboard. So it's really easy because there's so much, you're overwhelmed with the amount of data that comes through. So you've got to represent it in a way that's easy to understand. So this will tell me how many, 657 mentions of Glenn in February, the negative, a little bit positive, a little bit more negative, most of it was neutral. And we could tell where that chatter was coming from: mainstream news sites, Twitter, Facebook, blogs, and what the hot topics were. And this is a word cloud, and I'll explain a little bit about how the word clouds work in a minute, but that tells you, what the main conversations are. And of those main conversations, we give a few samples. So it gives them a constant update on what people are talking about. Is the chatter that's online the same as the chatter that's on national news and so on? So we can understand what our strategy should be and what we need to actually be worried about. So this is how it works. You scan the universe, you figure out what are the conversations that are going on out there, drill down a little bit further, so you go right down to an individual conversation. And I'll show you how that works. We did an exercise about 18 months ago for the Tourism New Zealand because we were concerned, Fishing World's one of our magazines, and we know that the online chatter worldwide about fishing is a lot greater than anything else that New Zealand tourism, mountain biking, skiing, snowboarding, skydiving, bungee, but most of the talk, more than twice as much talk online about fishing than anything that New Zealand is promoting itself for internationally. So we're saying, well, what the hell aren't you promoting New Zealand as a fishing destination, for goodness sake? There's a lot more chatter and a lot more people interested than that. And so this is the way we've represented it. And it was quite crude at first. All those little pixels, and each of those dots represents one conversation. And we can drill down and sort of touch on each of those conversations and find out what people are talking about. The blue ones are the positive conversations, the red ones are the negative conversations, and you can go in. For example, there's one about snowboarding, and you read that, it says, my ass hurts from snowboarding, ice please, okay, no ice, I've seen enough of that. So that was a conversation that someone had, and that was that one little pixel. So you can actually be quite voyeuristic and click on it, and it's very time consuming. And extremely, but you can do some really salacious stuff if you really drill far enough. But that was someone obviously complaining about snowboarding. So that's the kind of thing we look for. This one, fishing. You can see this 2,297 million mentions of fishing in that period of about a month. And Coast Guard bans the fishing off Maine, and that was the particular comment there. And the guy who wrote it was http://twitter.com intro to fishing. So you find out, well, okay, who is he? And you go online and you find his name was actually Wiley Walker. And that's his Twitter address. That's the comment he makes about himself. He loves fishing, and he lives in Battleground, Washington, USA. Drill a bit further, and you find out, well, who's actually influencing him? So how important is this guy? So you can actually click through and find out, is he an important guy? He's actually following 1,500 people, but he's got 1,100 followers himself, so he's actually quite influential. And what's he reading? Well, he's on Twitter, obviously, so these are all his Twitter comments. And these are all the people that he's actually following. So we can actually drill down and follow each of those conversations too if we want to. We waste a lot of time doing it, but it's really, if he's a very important guy, it's worth doing because you can find really important stuff. So what else is he reading? How is he getting his information? Well, he's obviously tracking his local TV channel, and he's on Flickr. And you can see he's interested in canal fishing in France, obviously, and then all these Facebook comments that he's got here. So we know exactly who he's talking to. We know what he's interested in and how to influence him. If we wanted to target him particularly, we'd know exactly where to go to do it. But more importantly, we know from Google Maps where he lives, and we can actually find his house. So, we a few geeks and Grey Lynn can do that, then imagine what the CIA do. But the important thing is that we can, I won't just pick those at random, but you can actually go anywhere you like. And this is one we did, we got a bit more sophisticated, and we started putting our neutral conversations. So the green ones, the green dots are the positive conversations, the red dots are the negative, and the white dots are just anything that's neutral. And this was, we started doing it about a year ago when there was a big hue and cry about Cadbury using palm oil in chocolate and stuff. And this tweet was, give the orangutan a break, stop start using palm oil from destroyed rainforest and so on. So you put in as a search word palm oil, who's talking about palm oil, who cares? And you get all this sort of feedback and you can follow all these conversations. And we know that there's a lot more, in this case, a lot more positive than neutral chatter. This particular guy, he was sick of Woolworths and inflated prices at some stage, so he must have been shopping and obviously a couple of years ago before the company. He's sick of Woolworths. I've started my own veggie patch. I've planted capsicum, rocket, lettuce, tomatoes, radish, beans, sweet peas. He also put his geolocation data in, and so we can go into Google Maps and find out where he lives. So if Now, it's interesting in this one, and because he's got quite a few followers. And we can follow. We can go to each of those people he's in touch with and follow their conversations through. And so, if you actually ever want to track somebody down, or someone who's got a bad experience with your business or any service they've had, you can go right through and find out, and just talk to them, and find out. I believe you've had a bad experience. It was interesting the other day, week before Christmas, I went to Mary Poppins. Now, we've got 6 kids. Now, we've just done Mary Poppins to death. I don't know why we actually went, because if I hear chimney one more time, I think I'll spew. And we decided, at half-time, we decided we just couldn't take any more chimneys, and we left. And we went across the road from the Civic, and it's the old Tony's restaurant, Victoria Street. So we hadn't been there for yonks. So it looks, go and grab a bite. So we went in, had the best steak in our lives. Beautiful. Absolutely. And my wife's a chef, so she likes, knows good stuff. And so she asked the waitress to ask the chef where the meat came from, and it turned out it came from McMaster and Daughters in Drury or Pukeko, whatever it was. I went online, and I thought that was so good. It was just before Christmas, so we needed to get a fillet of beef for Christmas dinner, and went online, rang them up, home delivered. It was just the best thing that ever happened. Because we used to shop at the Greylin Organic Butchery, and that closed out. It's now a cafe. So all those things are changing all the time. So I think, let's give it a crack. And there it was, and it was just, it was made for me. They'd done well in terms of what they'd done. So you could actually, and I've tweeted that on too. So that's how it happens. It grows organically. It goes out like ripples in a pond. And that's one of the things that's actually quite important about that whole networking idea. And you've got to understand that everyone is connected. As Carl Sagan said, everything's connected to everything else. If you really want to create an apple pie from scratch, you've first got to create the universe. It depends how far back you want to go, if you really mean, whatever you mean by starting from scratch. And one of the things that I think is worth understanding is just how we, I'm warming to the task, understand how it is that we actually reach people and who the important people in any conversation, in any business, in any industry are. And I don't know if you guys have ever read The Tipping Point. If you haven't, you should. It's a great book. It tells you why one shop will succeed, the one right next door won't, one restaurant will succeed, another one won't, how ideas catch on. And one of the points that Gladwell makes is that any good idea has to have 3 elements. It has to have sticky, it has to be a good idea, it has to be a sticky idea, and there has to be a few people, leading the charge, who actually make that idea, who are the advocates for it. And they're the opinion leaders. And as those opinion leaders in any industry, in any business, you have to try and understand. And the best way of explaining that, I think, is that notion of 6 degrees of separation, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but I don't know whether you're familiar with what I meant. What happened was a psychologist in Chicago University gave parcels to 160 people at random in Omaha, Nebraska, and asked them to get them to a stockbroker in Boston without putting them in the post. In other words, give them to somebody who they think might be able to give them to somebody who would give them to somebody who would eventually get to this guy in Boston. But the really interesting thing about it, and eventually, of course, over time they all ended up there, and the average number of hands the parcels went through to get to him was 6, which is where that whole 6 degrees of separation thing came from. But the interesting thing is, I'm not good with technology, it hates me. Of those that came to his home, 16 of them were handed